because I didn't do any streaming over the holidays, and I was really happy for that. That was a nice break that I needed. But now that we're back, I'm going to talk about something I did do, which I don't normally do, which is I played some stuff off stream over the holidays. And one that was on my list for so long, which I finally got to, was Untitled Goose Game, because Untitled Goose Game came out on the PS4, and that was rather a wonderful little thing to explore and to have some fun with. So I'm just going to pop that up there. Cool, brilliant. So Untitled Goose Game, really don't need to speak much about it. It's one of those things that came and became a bit of a phenomenon, but I don't want to actually talk about it from a review sense or anything. There's two particular bits of design that I really admire in it. One, I don't feel like I am the best person to talk about, but the other I feel like I can talk about at quite length. So I'll start off with the one I don't feel qualified to talk about, because I see it as my weakest, like my biggest weakness as a designer, and something I realized quite late in my game design career, is an Untitled Goose Game is aesthetically complete, is the best way I would phrase the term. Basically, throughout the UI, throughout the animation, throughout the color scheme chosen, the setting, the just the way everything is presented, it sets an aesthetic tone that is rounded and complete and is genuinely pleasing. It puts you in an emotional mindset. It rounds everything out. Nothing looks out of place. I think that is one of the two primary achievements of Untitled Goose Game, but it's not the one I'm going to talk about, because I came to this realization quite late in my game design career of how important sort of aesthetic completion and complementary parts are, but the way I very briefly describe that is, this game wouldn't work if it wasn't about a goose. As in, you could take this exact same game mechanic and you could reskin it to a small child, and the game would play completely differently. It would be a different game. You can't separate the aesthetic from what makes this game so appealing. So that's the thing I'm not going to talk about, because, as I say, I feel that it is one of the things that I am weaker on. And yeah, so what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about the faux sandbox design, or rather the appearance of freedom. This is something that's always fascinated me since my favorite game, on my favorite first sort of proper PC game rather than Commodore game I played, which was Quest for Glory, or Hero's Quest as it was originally called. Basically, that was a very limited game, but it felt like a big open sandbox. It felt like a Skyrim, but it wasn't a Skyrim. It was more like Untitled Goose Game. So Untitled Goose Game, to the naive eye, would appear like this massive physics sandbox with these really complex NPC AIs. So for those of you who don't know the game, it's mostly about doing these set of tasks which have been set for you. So you do a whole bunch of stuff to cross off the list, and it feels like a world that is alive and systemic in design, but it's not actually that what should I say, systemic or emergent. This has been really carefully crafted and designed. So the best way I can explain it is, each of these carrots that have been placed there are individual objects with their own trigger zones and colliders, and the gardener's AI, for example, is much more like, even though I know some of the people who have worked on this game, I have not spoken to them about the development of this game because I only know them a little bit. So but I can tell from how I've played through this game and how these sort of games are developed. So he's not. If I was building this game, my intuition when I set out to build this game would be to design behavior trees for the NPCs that were quite reusable and complex. But what's been done here is there's actually very sort of simple, discrete AI states that have been set up for this gardener, and he's resetting things in a certain way, and a lot of the pathfinding and a lot of the object interaction, it's all handmade. So if you look at their development cycle and you look at some of their early prototypes, so here now I've locked him in a loop because he's like, I need to get the keys, but I can't get the keys because and that actually breaks him, completely breaks him, because they didn't think about the specific situation. So yeah, if you go back to their earlier prototypes and you look at their earlier designs, they oh, where's he gone? He normally gets stuck on that gate. Oh, because we've unlocked this area, he's actually gonna do the full round the house route. There we go. Give him his keys. Oh. Has his pathfinding gone a bit wobble? I'm really trying to get him unstuck here and give him his keys. Yeah, mate, there's your keys. But yeah, he easily gets stuck. But if you look at the earlier developments and prototypes of their game, you'll notice that it was mostly there. Like, yes, maybe some of the animation polish and stuff wasn't there, but they had a lot of content work to do because, as I say, so many of these interactions are bespoke, and that's but the key thing here is to give the player the concept of freedom, like they can do anything. So this is a classic problem in traditional sort of text adventure games, and one of the ways that Sierra designers would deal with this is because Sierra designers, you had old text parsers where you type in whatever, so the range of actions were very, very broad, is they would have a keylogger in their sort of test version of the game where they would basically sit down people to play, King's Quest or Leisure Suit Larry or whatever, and they would have a text file of all the things people tried to type in and it didn't do anything, and then they would go back and they would add in a line or an acknowledgement of, oh, that does something, and so that's kind of what the Untitled Goose Game guys have done as well, where they have put in very small amounts of objects and they've gone, oh, well, why isn't the person reacting to this thing that I as a player have done, and they're writing sort of the bespoke interactions as it goes along. Like here, this walkie-talkie, this is a very bespoke system that is not critical path, but you need for this little bit here, where you can go, and there's no other object in the game that interacts like this. So like whenever I speak, but I can take this through to the other areas and I can trick the other NPCs with this particular thing. Yeah, it's a really interesting approach, because when you compare this to something like Noita, or another more sandboxy approach, the amount of time you will spend handcrafting little bits is so much higher, but it's a much more solvable problem, you know, as in like if you wanted to add an extra 20 hours of gameplay on Untitled Goose Game, the amount of work you would have to do is significant, whereas if you were building a sandbox game, you just sort of naturally get those 20 hours. But I would argue if you look at the amount of hours played for the average person for Untitled Goose Game, it's quite a short game. But I think that's one of the things that was the strength of it, is most people have finished the game. They might not have finished all the additional harder to do challenges or the time challenges and things like that. But I think most people who picked up this game finished it. And I don't think many people would have minded the length of the game. In fact, I think a lot of people probably appreciated the length of the game. So there is a strong argument for avoiding the complex problems of making this a more systemic emergence system and going for this very handcrafted approach, because it does mean that you can do every little bit. Now there are some downsides. There are some other 90s games that I want to dig up and I want to talk about in the future that were very much in this genre, but this genre sort of fell out of favor because this only works as an indie title, and the commerce of it gets a bit screwed up as you sort of scale up to bigger budgets and longer play times and things like that. So there are some interesting dynamics about that. But for the size of the team, because it's a very small team, for the size of the budget, because it's a very small budget, you get a lot of bang for buck. The other thing that's made this kind of game a lot more economical and a lot more sensible to design has been the rise of sort of middleware engines like Unity. Because if you were building an engine for this game, it would be a lot of wasted effort, because there's nothing technically interesting or superior about this game, as in it is a wonderful achievement of artistry, of design, of level design and all that, but there's nothing that requires a unique technical stack in this. This is mostly just and I want to say this in a way that is not in any way negative. It's implementable with quite simple logic. It's very, very achievable. As in, you could make Untitled Goose Game in Dreams, for example. You would have some quite big gadgets for the NPC AIs and stuff, but this is totally doable in Dreams, because it's all just about hand-tooled animations, hand-tooled reactions like that. You're not going to get that systemically. That is that very specific use case of, oh, I'm inside the box and I jump out the box and I scare the person. So it's all very, very bespoke. But yeah, as I say, the limited vocab of interactions, like there's not a lot of things you as a player can do, but every one of them has been thought of and accounted for. And there's this what is sometimes called theme park design, where in a theme park you want to feel like you're on an adventure, you want to feel like you're in this larger space with infinite possibility, but you're actually on a very carefully crafted railroad, as in, or more correctly, theme park ride, as in most players who experience this game will experience the same game. There's not a lot of divergent gameplay in how people experience Untitled Goose Game, you know, and there's a lot of power in that, because as a theme park designer, it means you can account for this exact moment and you can acknowledge it. You can put a little quirkiness into it, and that will in some ways actually make it feel more like it's systemic and more like it's alive and unique. And that's it's a weirdness and it's a trickery. And for a long time, as a player and a game designer, I found it quite frustrating and annoying, because once you see behind the curtain, once you see behind the magic, you can become a bit disillusioned with this design approach. But as I've come to appreciate it more, both as a player and a designer, I realized that the theme park design is not about lying to the player, but it's about delivering this bespoke experience. You know, you don't want to make this complex emergent, you know, goose system. What you're wanting to do is make a funny story about a goose oh, excuse me, who constantly steals from these villagers and is a complete dick to these villagers, and he's a terror to them. And yeah, there's a real beauty in that approach to game design, and it's just something I wanted to highlight and talk about, because it's not often that I play a game like this, and it was so compact in its decision making. Like, this is such a small world, and there is garden, shop, backyard, pub, small world. There's 5 areas in this entire game, and the 5th area is a bit of a repeat of the first 4. I mean, not including like the starting area, whatever. But this is really tight space, and all the events handle into there. And you could, if you wanted, make a wiki page that had every single interactable object in the game listed out. I know this sounds like a large number, but I believe there's less than 200 interactions in the entire game. Now that's not like a full matrix of interaction, but yeah, in terms of unique objects, bear in mind that a lot of them are reusing their behaviors. So, like for instance, you know, you've got like the tomato and whatnot, but I don't think there's anything special about the tomato, and I don't think the tomato is used in any particular puzzle. But other than sort of their unique name, where they sometimes will have a unique interaction, they mostly behave the same. Of if they're out of place, return to the original location. You know, it's more like, oh, if you put this very specific object in this very specific place, this thing will happen, and there's going to be a system for sort of pickup and such. But yeah, no, it's a very, it's not a complex game, but its execution is everything. And that's, I think, the beauty that I find in this, because you could get really wrapped up in making it so that all these things behave in this complex myriad of ways, where if you combine A, B, and C together, and like if a younger Claire was sitting down to design this game, that's what I would have done, and it would have been a mistake, because it works in like a Noita, because that's the chaos of it, that the setting is appropriate to it, and there's a lot of systems that drive that forward. But in a Untitled Goose game, I think I would estimate 95% of players who ever play this don't realize how fenced in and restricted they are. In fact, most of them will feel this wonderful sense of freedom, of every idea that they want to do has been accounted for, because unless you have a very broad vocabulary of games that you've played, or you spend more than 15 hours with this game, and I would would argue most players probably spend between 5 and 10 hours with this game, if that. You're not going to ever feel like, oh, there's a thing you wanted to do and it's not accounted for, because all of these interactions are accounted for. They've done enough testing and they've done enough design that when you honk through the harmonica it sounds funny, and you know they've accounted for a lot of weirdness. So yeah, no, it's this really interesting lesson that Jesse Schell's book on game design was the first book that really comprehensively took me through. But and I've learned to appreciate it in other places, but this was the first game that really blew me away in its execution of this concept, of this theme park design concept. Because usually, especially when you see this in larger AAA games where there is a very large budget, I don't think this approach scales as well as it used to. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, and I think there's certain genres of games and certain interaction modes that work better for this. But it's good to see something as clean and crisp in execution as this. And yeah, I just wanted to run through that theme park design, that sandbox, and I wanted to just talk about it a bit because, as I say, I played this off stream. I was really chuffed with it, and I think it's an interesting use case. So with that, we are going to conclude the recorded segment. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is a live show that we do on Twitch, 8:30 in the mornings on weekdays. And if you want to join us live, come onto the Twitch channel. So for those of you on the recording,